Why doesn't my machine's IP address match what I'm told on the internet? Hi everyone, Leo Notenboom here for askleo.com. Here's a question I get again from time to time. Using tools on my machine, I can see that my IP address is one thing. In my case, 192.168.1.100. But when I go to an internet site that shows me my IP, it shows me something completely different. Which one's right? Well, they both are. Your machine has one IP address, but that isn't necessarily the IP address that's actually used to connect to the internet. The IP address that appears depends on who's looking and from where. Honestly, Windows doesn't come with any great utilities to make finding your computer's IP address easy. Now, before you object, I'm not talking about your internet IP address. I'm talking about the IP address of your computer, which is not something you'll get from a website. The simplest way to find the IP address of your computer is by running a Windows command prompt. In that command prompt, enter the command ipconfig followed by enter. What you'll see is a bunch of information. In this image, I've highlighted the IP address that was assigned to the computer's network adapter. This is the IP address of the computer. Calling something an Internet IP address feels redundant, as IP stands for Internet Protocol. As the Internet Protocol is often used even when we're not directly connected to the Internet, it's not really that silly to talk about an IP address on the Internet, or its Internet Protocol address. There are several sites on the web you can visit to learn your Internet IP address. For example, here's mine via whatismyipaddress.com. Of course, I've blocked out the specifics, but you can see that it is showing you a different IP address, in my case, starting with 24.17. So why is that different than your computer's IP address? Well, we need to back up and take a look at exactly how IP addresses are assigned. In most cases, Internet IP addresses are assigned dynamically. In this example, your computer is using a protocol called DHCP for Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol to connect to its ISP or network provider. It asks for an IP address, and the ISP assigns one. From here, that IP address identifies that computer on the internet. The IP address may change each time the computer connects. It may be given a different IP address. That's why it's called a dynamic IP address. A static IP address is, well, static. It doesn't change. Your computer doesn't ask your ISP for an IP address. Before you connect, both the computer and the ISP are pre-configured manually to know what the IP address is from the start and the computer that it's going to refer to. Most of the rest of this video applies equally well to static and dynamic assignment, except the details of how IP addresses are actually assigned. Dynamic is by far the most common and almost certainly what you're using. Now, let's insert a router into this mix. The previous example was just a computer connected to the internet, connected to your ISP. The router sits between the computer and the internet. When you turn it on or attach it to your ISP's provided connection, one of the first things the router does is the same thing. It asks for an IP address. Now, note that it asks for and receives an IP address from your ISP. That address identifies it, the router, on the internet. Now, at some point, you turn on your computer, which is connected to the router. The computer also asks for an IP address. It makes its request, and this time it receives an IP address back from the router. Note that the 192.168 address is special. You'll never see IP addresses beginning with 192.168 or 10. Or 172.16 through 172.31 on the internet. Those are reserved specifically for use by local networks, which is exactly what we've just set up. If you connect a second computer to your router, you're building a local network or LAN. Note that the two computers each get a unique and different IP address assigned by the router. And yet that router has its own IP address that connects it to the internet. Now, what happens when one of these computers makes a request that accesses something on the internet? The computers get to the internet through the router. So that first step looks like this. The computer makes a request that gets sent to the router. The router then passes that request to the internet via your ISP. Now, to the internet, it looks like the router is making the request. Remember, the internet cannot see your internal IP address, so the router translates from the internal address, 192.168.1.100, to the external, 1.2.3.4 in my example here. When the response arrives, that same translation happens in reverse. The router keeps track of which computer on the local area network, or LAN, side the request belongs to and routes the response appropriately. That's what's called NAT, Network Address Translation. The router manages the IP addresses on a LAN, or local area network, and then translates to the appropriate IP address as connections are made across the internet. There are two major reasons why NAT is used, perhaps even when only one computer is connected to a router. All the devices behind the router appear to use exactly one IP address on the internet. You may have heard that the internet is running out of IP addresses, and this technique was initially developed as a way around that. It's a way to connect a large number of computers on the internet while using only a single IP address. Connections can only be initiated outbound. This turns your router into a very powerful firewall. The computer behind the router can make connections to servers out on the internet, like perhaps askleo.com. Once established, that connection then can transfer data in either direction, but it had to be initiated by your computer. A computer out on the internet cannot initiate a connection to your machine. There's no protocol to traverse the router in the reverse direction. Your router prevents outside computers from randomly connecting to yours. Now, even if the first issue weren't true, I would still recommend a NAT router as a firewall. It is that simple and that powerful. So, your computer can appear to have two IP addresses. The local IP address assigned to the computer's hardware by your router, and then the internet IP address of your router. This is the IP address visible to the connections you make to the sites and services you use on the internet. Both IP addresses have really important roles to play. For updates, for comments, for links related to this topic and more, visit askleo.com/2506. I'm Leo Notenboom, and this is askleo.com. Thanks for watching.